Hi, this is my redo of Project 1, Critical Analysis of an Instructional Design Model, Approach, or Framework. I like this approach and have recently started working with it, and so chose it as my topic. So this presentation is a journey through the backward design approach, and it begins with an overarching theoretical paradigm. This theory may be summed up pretty well in the words of Wiggins and McTee in their book Understanding by Design on page 14. They say, if you don't know exactly where you're going, any road will get you there. This approach to designing instruction has three main steps. Identifying the desired results is the first step. What will the successful learner take away after the instruction is over? Next is determining what evidence will best reflect that the learning did take place and how to create that evidence. Finally, the last step is what should be presented to the learner to achieve the end we had in mind at the beginning of the instructional design. This would be the content. And those three steps pretty much constitute a brief summary of the backward design approach. But first, before we go into the details, there's some insights from the field. Fox and Dougherty wrote an article, Design to Learn, Learn to Design, that describes how intentional teaching is similar to backward design in at least one respect. Deliberate connections between learning objectives and content and delivery, the design, and assessments. There's more of an emphasis on results, the assessment results, than the inputs, which is the content. There is a partnership between all of these, but it's an unequal one. The teacher continues to decide what will be taught, but with more of an emphasis on what the successful learner will take with them at the end of the course. Jay McTeague is a co-author of Understanding by Design, the book that introduced the backward design approach with Grant Wiggins in the late 1990s. In this article, Backward Design for Forward Action, he and Ronald Thomas address the importance of assessments and how backward design can ensure that decisions are driven by data. Decisions that are informed by this data are made at many levels during curriculum planning by the teacher and at the school system level, and the need to determine appropriate planning relies on this data. Rather than viewing this reliance as a hindrance, and some would say teaching the test or teaching to the test, Jay McTeague states that focusing on and teaching the key ideas behind those standards will result in deep learning that will provide a conceptual lens through which to address any educational standard at any level. This can be found on page 53. He says that this emphasis will result in authentic performance, which can translate to performing well on standardized tests, because the instructor-designer has already unpacked the key big ideas. There are limitations, of course, and there will be more on these limitations of the data emphasis later. Wiggins and McTee say that backward design is more of a recipe than a step-by-step guide. They do include a template, and in that template, it states the most important part, that choosing content is the last step, because the designer and instructor would know what is needed to reach those goals that were determined earlier. So in the cookbook analogy, the ingredients, the content would be chosen last. How to make the dish would be chosen before that, and the goal, so an analogy would be what you're going to make, would be first. This recipe cookbook type analogy and backward design is not a linear process. The design and the feedback are in motion. All designs are iterative unless they are strictly prescriptive models that must be followed rigidly. Wiggins and McTee show many iterations here in this image. This image is similar to the one found on page 273 of their book, and I added it here instead of the direct image from the book because it shows that feedback is central to the iterative process. So this image clearly shows that backward design is not a prescriptive model, and there's lots of room for formative assessment at many steps, as we can see. So we are still on the road to instructional design that is effective. So in choosing an instructional design model, designers usually start with questions from some framework that helps guide them in their choice. There are 6 criteria from Edmonds, Branchin, and Mukherjee's framework for assessing design approaches, models, and frameworks. They show us contexts from which to make an instructional design choice. Let's look at these issues and see under which circumstances the best design approach is the most useful. So here we ask ourselves, in which cases backward design approaches work best? Let's start with an overview of all the factors that go into this decision. We need to talk about and think about the purpose or orientation of the environment, the type of knowledge that needs to be learned, the amount of expertise required by the ID or the teacher to implement the design, the theory or systems or intuition required for the process, the context, and the level at which the learning and instructions would take place. In the case of backward design, instructors are encouraged to describe the environment in which instruction will take place. So they will have to rely on their practical experience and intuition to shape their perception of that environment. So this is the type of orientation and knowledge that the instructors would need. And so they can plan accordingly once they realize that the type of orientation and knowledge will be supported by the approach that they have chosen. So we could see how the backward design approach could be considered a limitation by a novice instructor due to the lack of step-by-step instructions, since they wouldn't have much practical experience upon which to base their decisions. So the backward design approach could be considered, more descriptive. It's definitely not a prescriptive approach. It relies a lot on teacher and instructional designer intuition. Backward design supports instruction based on declarative knowledge and the norm referenced evaluations, which are the standards that we mentioned before. And these types of tasks and knowledge are increasingly important in high-stakes testing. So both declarative and procedural knowledge can be appropriately designed by the backward design approach. So the backward design approach does require some training for the practitioner. So let's look at some of the types of orientation and required expertise of the instructors. Usually the novice instructor may not be able to make the necessary determinations about what steps to take or what decisions need to be made, as we mentioned before. Here's a common example that was covered in the book by Wiggins and McTee. A novice teacher may be more activity and coverage focused, thinking that the more content that is available to their students, the better. This approach makes sense. Why limit the amount of material from which to choose until the teacher realizes that time and resource limitations, not to mention student burnout and waste of mental energy, or even cognitive load issues, will play a role in whether the backward design will be successful. This is also called hands-on but minds off, and Wiggins and McTee call them, meaning activity and coverage-focused approaches, the twin sins of design. So as far as the theoretical origins of backward design or understanding by design, I would say that authenticity is the basis to Wiggins' argument that an activity or coverage focus does not yield the results in this age of high-stakes testing. A study by Newman from 1996 measured how well 24 restructured schools, meaning they implemented the backward design approach. It measured how these schools implemented authentic practices like higher order thinking, deep knowledge approaches, and connections to the outside real world instead of that activity and coverage focused approach. They found that even inequalities between high and low performing students were greatly decreased. So we have seen the amount of decisions that go into choosing an instructional design approach. Now let's look at some more contexts. So backward design is used in all contexts and levels of instruction, from K-12 to the ODEE course design, where I work and I'm learning about it, to training modules for employees, to the military. Unlike rapid prototyping, which is best used for smaller units of instruction due to its iterative nature, at a small level, the backwards design approach kind of takes a big overview, trying to figure out what the learners should have gained after the instruction is over. So Wiggins and McTee, in their book Understanding by Design, acknowledge that there is some frustration with the lack of a step-by-step design to follow. So that's a limitation. And they acknowledge that teachers who have been teaching a certain way their entire lives will come up with the yes but type scenarios, and these are all valid questions. There's a template offered in their book, as we've mentioned before. It's really a guide with guiding questions. But proponents of the Willis R2-D2 design process, reflective recursive design and development, would say that beginning with the end in mind is in fact dealing with fuzzy objectives, that these objectives would be refined with the clarity that comes as the design process moves forward. And then that will influence the objectives. And there is some iteration in the backward design approach, but they are very emphatic in the emphasis of beginning with that end in mind, and that sometimes is difficult for seasoned teachers to change from, especially if they've been doing the activity and content coverage, which we talked about before. So yeah, the R2-D2 design process would find flaws with backward design's emphasis on beginning with the learning objectives and the goals first, but they would realize that it is an iterative process. So there are many of these yes but thoughts which recognize the value of backward design. You know, that teachers would recognize that, but their objections, like there's too much content to cover, we have to teach to the test, and we have to unlearn prior practice, are all overcomable. They're valid points, and these objections are why the required expertise of the backward design approach is kind of at an intermediate or maybe even at an expert level. At least it would be easier for instructors to be at those levels. But with training or natural experience, any teacher can utilize the backward design approach. Backward design is used at ODEE in course design and at Kickstart Week, so it is a journey that's well worth the effort. So this ends our journey through a mildly controversial and yet well-known and frequently implemented instructional design approach called backward design. Thank you for this opportunity to present my new improved take on this instructional design method.